way earlier, but our service went a little late because we had a lot of singing to do. A lot of singing, which is awesome. I love it. Torah deserves to be sang. Scripture deserves to be sang. It definitely is worthwhile. So when we sing it, it's something really amazing and special. All right. So to remind those of you who are already here in the room, I kind of bit off a really big topic a while ago. We decided to set to this whole trajectory of studying what we call early Judaism, or the diversity of the Second Temple era. And when I say Judaism, what I really mean is Judaisms. There are many kinds of Judaism coexisting at the same time in antiquity. Today, we may have fewer divisions, and some of our divisions are even deeper. But there was a true, colorful, amazing diversity of Judaism in the ancient times. And some of these Judaisms, some of these religious movements have ceased to be. They're not here anymore. We know about them from books and references and places, but we can't always go up to those people and say, hey, what do you actually believe? What is your take on life? What is your take on Torah? So today we're getting into a variety or into Judaism that is actually still around. It's one of those that people know very little about, but it is still around. And so if you haven't guessed it, we're going to be talking about Samaritans. Samaritan Judaism, or Samaritan Israelites, as I like to call them. So the question that I need to ask at the very beginning of our study, who are the Samaritans? What makes Samaritans, and I mean ancient Samaritans, not necessarily modern Samaritans, maybe you know some about modern Samaritans, but what makes them different from all the other Israelites? Are they Jews? Are they foreigners? These are all not simple questions, but they require us to entangle some things, some language, and some key events of history to actually make sense of my questions. But what is your take? What do you know? What have you heard? What have you been told? And what have you been taught about the Samaritans? What are they? Who are they?
5 books of Moses only.
5 books of Moses only. So they're the 5 books of Moses guys. Okay.
Well, in the most practical sense, we're all Americans.
Right.
We live in America.
Right.
It's not really an ethnic designation. Samaria was a place.
Thank you. That's a very beautifully put, Jeremy. Samaritans are people who live in Samaria. So if I start putting up pictures of Americans on my slide right here, and I would have people come up that look all different, that are all different colors, all different ethnic backgrounds, all different religious backgrounds, by the way, and I'll say they're all Americans, right? You would have no problem accepting that they're Americans. They live in America. This is their country. This is their land. They may differ politically, religious, in every kind of way possible, but they will all be called Americans. And that's kind of how the case was with Samaritans, although historically their names, their designations, their ethnicity, their religious life were kind of sort of twisted to serve purposes that I would say were the purposes of one particular segment of population, one particular theological take, one particular way of seeing the world, which would definitely be not Samaritan. So they were defined by people who are not them. And whenever people define you for who you are, you know how that always ends. That always kind of ends sideways. So that's why I think sometimes Samaritans need a little rehabilitation and they need a little bit of help for us to sort out their history, their origins, where do they really fall, in order for us to be fair to them. Because I think a lot of times we are unfair to them. And so, and that means some rereading will do. So in this particular session, I'm going to jump into this a little bit, and in the next session, we're going to look a little bit more at the history, how they came to be, their origins as a people. That's going to be a little bit more historical. Today, I'll get into a little bit of their distinctives in history, but not too deep, not too much, not just yet. So as a people, ancient Judeans and ancient Samaritans drifted apart in the days when the 12 Israelite tribes formed 2 kingdoms in the 10th century BC. So if you want to know where Samaritans really started being different from all the others, from all the other Israelites. It's really the 10th century BCE. Judah solidified behind the Davidic dynasty in Jerusalem. Israel formed its center in Samaria. And that began really the foundation upon which Samaritans as a people group, as a religious movement, as really a way of life, that's where they will emerge from. But it's not as simple because we really have to walk through the pages of history to appreciate them for who they are. So a small Samaritan community actually continues to exist in central Israel even today. They still live in the same very area where they were from, amazingly, actually not far at all from the very bones of Joseph from which we were talking about. Just a stone's throws away if you want to think about it. That's how close they live to that. But for 3,000 years, just think about it, both the Judeans and the Samaritans underwent many changes. Jews that you know today are not the same Jews that we read about in the Bible. Don't ever make a mistake of comparing the two. Yes, there are similarities and there's a line of succession, but the differences sometimes are quite vast. Comparing modern Jews and modern Samaritans, the differences are much sharper and much more obvious. Because of the 3,000 years of history, they actually lived apart from each other. But the difference between the two groups in Yeshua's day were much less pronounced. I want you to think about the Jews and Samaritans in the first century of Common Era were more alike than different. Today, I think there's probably more differences than similarities. The overlap is a lot less. But like I said, history does not stand still. It moves on. And people are what they are because of the things that they've lived through and what they've suffered through a lot of times. So, though many Jews kept their distance from Samaritans for quite a while, the Gospels indicate that Yeshua and his disciples actually had many interactions with the Samaritans. Some of those interactions were negative, and some of those interactions were positive. Do you remember at least some of them, perhaps? So I have a couple here for you on the screen that I might get into a little bit more in detail later. But for now, I just want to mention to you that in John chapter 8, verse 28, Judean authorities labeled Yeshua himself as a Samaritan with a demon. They said he's a Samaritan and he's overtaken by the demon. That's what they called Yeshua. So not very flattering characterization, right? So he's a demon-possessed Samaritan. That's what they called him. Not very nice. Obviously, they had a problem with him. Obviously, they wanted to call him unflattering names, and that's what it was. But, you know, being mixed up with Samaritans, that's what he was. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 5, Yeshua specifically says to his disciples not to go and spread his message in the cities of the Gentiles and stay away from Samaritans. I don't know if you remember that or not. A lot of people get on Matthew's case because they say Matthew is anti-Samaritan because look at what he says, you know. And well, he's just quoting what Yeshua said. The Master said, as you go, spread out, you know, the good news. Do not go to the Samaritans and do not go into the cities of the Gentiles. Now, there were cities of Gentiles in Israel. They're called the Decapolis. Okay? They were primarily non-Jewish. They were very Hellenistic cities. That's where all the Roman columns and pagan altars would come from. That's all of that. So they were definitely cities of what we call the occupiers, right? At that time, the colonizers of that day, they established their footholds in Israel, and they were there. And so Yeshua says, don't go to those cities and do not go to the Samaritans as he sent them out to spread his good news. Now, if you really want to know what it's about, perhaps I'll talk about it a little bit later. No, Yeshua is not anti-Samaritan or anything like that. As we'll see from other stories, it's not quite like that. The relationship is complicated. What I want you to realize is where Samaria is. If you look at the map, and this is a modern map, so you could see the Dead Sea, the big body of water right there in the middle of Israel. See the ridge of mountains and there's a body of water. If you go north, you'll see a small body of water. That's the Galilee. That's the Sea of Galilee. So in between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, that entire strip of the land moving towards Mediterranean was populated by Samaritans. And the only place you could pass by in the non-Samaritan lands was to go into the valley of the River Jordan and just follow from the Galilee down into that lowlands valley towards the Dead Sea, and you come to Jericho, and you take a turn, and you go to Jerusalem that way. So you make a big hook to get there. Or you can go to the coast and follow along the coastal highway, which is called Via Maris back then. That's the trade route, the traditional King's Highway. You can follow that, and you can get to Jerusalem that way, but that means you're also taking a long way around from Galilee. You go from the sea to the coast, then you move south all the way, and then you make that hook back to Jerusalem, because where you're really going is Jerusalem. So you're going to go like this, make that kind of a sea, or you're going to go like this and make that kind of a sea, bypassing that territory of the Samaritans. Like I said, people had complicated relationship with Samaritans, and there's a reason why. The communities didn't always see eye to eye. Jews and Samaritans did not always welcome each other, and a lot of Jews did not want to go through Samaria because it was not a very hospitable place to them. So here's an example for you. This is Luke chapter 9. Luke, by the way, is very friendly supposedly to Samaritans, but I'll let you decide. Luke chapter 9. When the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went, and he entered a village, all the Samaritans, to make arrangements for him. And they did not receive him, because he was traveling towards Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. So let's remember the story and understand what it is. Now, first of all, there's an obvious funny mistranslation is what I'm going to call this. In the very, very first verse, it says, the days were approaching for his ascension. Whenever a Christian hears the word ascension, what are they thinking about?
Resurrection.
Yeshua going up to heaven, right? Do you think this is where it is? This is Luke 9, by the way. Do you think that's what it is, right? So it's a little bit misleading. When it says ascension, what do you think that word actually truly means?
Aliyah.
Aliyah, thank you. Once you translate it into Hebrew, everything makes sense. So when a person makes aliyah and they go up to the Torah, they come up. They sit over here, they come up, they read from the Torah. When Yeshua was making his ascent, not ascension, but going up where? He was determined to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is always up. You cannot go down to Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem. You never go down. You always go up. Everywhere where you read in the Bible, it says, let us go up to Jerusalem. You will never see going down. Even if they're coming from the north and they're going south, guess what? They're still going up to Jerusalem. That is the language of the Bible. It is all throughout. I don't care if you read the Hebrew Bible, you read the New Testament, it's going to be the same. So as he's going up to Jerusalem, he sends messengers ahead of him to make arrangements. Why? Because he has to stop over somewhere. You see, there's not a Hilton on the way. He needs a place to stop. And he needs a place to eat and sleep and drink. And he's probably traveling with a whole entourage of other people. So he goes to one of the Samaritan villages and he sends people ahead of time. Can you please host us? Can we have this many beds to sleep and that many places to stay? And they say, no. No, we're not going to welcome you. We're not going to host you. Why? Because he's going to Jerusalem. He's going to Jerusalem. And what's the problem with going to Jerusalem? Well, Jerusalem, according to Samaritans, is not the place where you should worship the God of Israel. And what kind of an Israelite are you if you're so bent on going to Jerusalem? Because everybody knows, well, in the Samaritan circles, everybody knows that you shouldn't be going to Jerusalem. That is not the place. So, of course, the disciples get really upset. You know, why would you not show us hospitality? What kind of a backwards bent people are you? We need help. We need a place to stay. You know, you're not going to show us hospitality. Can we just call the fire down upon them from heavens and destroy them? So you can understand. John and James, they were known. The sons of Zebedee were known to be hot-tempered Jewish men. So they're like, all right, fire coming down upon these no-good Samaritans. And Yeshua said, cool it. Now, let's just go to another village. Maybe they will accept us. So you could see a conflict in these verses, but you can also see resolution. But what I want you to see is what the conflict is about. The conflict is about the fact that this Jew is going to Jerusalem to worship, and the Samaritans are not about to provide him help and aid him in any way to accommodate his smooth journey to Jerusalem. He decided to go through Samaria. Remember on the map, just straight going, moving south. No, actually probably would have been better for him to go to make that big huge C and go in a big roundabout way. Why? Because at least over there nobody is going to prohibit him in this way. So that's why a lot of Jews did not travel through Samaria as they made their pilgrimages to the temple. We talked about how people make pilgrimages to the temple all the time, and this was something that people did multiple times a year if they could. If they couldn't, at least annually or something like this, they would come to Jerusalem, bring a sacrifice, bring an offering, bring the first fruits, bring whatever it is that they were setting aside from their fields as farmers or from their flocks to bring to Hashem. But a lot of times that's what people did, and Yeshua did the same thing. So he was determined to go, and they would not host him. So you could hopefully see the issue. The issue is that he's going to Jerusalem. And what's the big deal about that? Well, you see, ancient Samaritans, they rejected Jerusalem as a place chosen by God to build a holy place and offer sacrifices. Instead, they worshipped on Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim. And I'm actually showing you Mount Gerizim right there. And this is the verse. I want you to read this and think of why would, Samaritans think Gerizim is special. This is Deuteronomy chapter 11, where God is speaking through Moses, and he says, "And it shall come about, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim, and the curse on Mount Ebal. For you are about to cross the Jordan and go and take possession of the land which the Lord your God is giving you." So in the days of Joshua, actually Israelites crossed into the land at this very spot, at this very area. Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal stand together. At the bottom of that mountain is the valley, and that is the place where today Joseph's tomb is. And this is the place that was bought, essentially, by Jacob for his sons. And so all of these historical events that we are studying in the Torah, the things that we're reading about the bones of Joseph, it's all actually happening right here. Because as they enter the land, this is where everything happens. And so why would you think that people would consider Mount Gerizim to be special? Because a special ceremony takes on the Mount Gerizim as Israelites enter the land. Actually, circumcisions happen. Actually, sacrifices happen. All sorts of things. It's a place where Israel worships God in a very meaningful and special way for the first time in the land of their own now. And Mount Gerizim becomes the Mount of blessing, okay? Right down the street, or literally, not I guess figuratively speaking down the street, but not far away, is a little place called Shiloh. Shiloh is where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was actually placed. You can actually see this place even today. And for many, many years, that's where it was. And that's where the ark was until it was moved to Jerusalem later on. But it stayed there, not near the mountain of blessings. So you see, Samaritans weren't really that crazy or far off. They established Mount Gerizim as a meaningful place for worshiping God. And they established that as a site where God of Israel can be met and worshipped in this special way. And it goes all the way back to the days of Joshua. It goes all the way back to when Israelites first entered the land. Please understand, their history is very ancient, and their reasons are actually quite biblical. The only difference is that God has seen another place for his name to dwell, and they did not get the memo, or at least they didn't agree with the memo. So, hence, that is the conflict. That's why Jerusalem now is the enemy of Gerizim. The two mountains become rival. And that starts stirring people up. And they, of course, each community wants to stand up for their mountain, as you can understand. And this is the beginning of where people who live in Samaria and people who live in Judea, in Jerusalem vicinity, having a bit of a problem between each other. Ideologically and practically of where and how God should be worshipped. So hopefully this conflict makes sense to you a little bit. Now, the Samaritan temple was built right there on Mount Gerizim. In the Second Temple era it was built. It was destroyed by none other by the Judean king himself. So a Jewish king by the name John Hyrcanus, one of the descendants of the famous Maccabees. In the year 128 BCE, he destroyed their temple. Samaritans still continue to worship on Mount Gerizim even today. So this is a picture from just a few years back. They're holding a ceremony on the top of the Mount Gerizim. So they're very persistent about not changing their customs. They're very, very much stuck in the ways that they have been for all this time. And though they're not a huge community, they still continue today. And of course, it doesn't help the fact that it was a Jewish king who destroyed their temple, right? But Maccabees had very aggressive political ambitions. They wanted to unite a kingdom. They wanted a united Jewish kingdom. And that meant destroying things that were not working for them because they were working against them. Certainly Samaritans challenged the unity of that entire region. And that's why their temple was destroyed. So anyway, it's a bit of a history that perhaps we can come back to a little bit later and read about it. Samaritans are also the only Israelite group who continue to worship through animal sacrifices by slaughtering and roasting lambs on Passover. Even today, that's what they do. Just as it was done in antiquity, they take lambs, they offer them, they roast them over fire and consume them on the night of Passover. There's a big gathering that usually happens around Samaritan Passover, which does not fall, by the way, on Jewish Passover. They have different calendars. But they do slaughter lambs, and they do it just like in the days of Moses. Like I said, if anything, Samaritans are very consistent. They don't like the change. They stick with their ways, and their ways of worship, even in the modern world, to change. It's the only group of Israelites of any sort of variety that continues to offer sacrifices. I think that's very unique, and I'm always intrigued by that because, like, to me, the very physical act of doing it, the very mechanics of going through that is fascinating.
It makes sense because their place wasn't complete, like they're still in their place. And
They're still in their place.
Yeah, they still have a form of being able to do that.
They have never been displaced. They never left where they originated from. Okay, their home base. They never left. They are still living in the same neighborhood they've been living from the time you can say they came to be, essentially. So yes, they never abandoned that same form of worship that they've had all these years. I saw a hand over there somewhere. Yes, sir.
I want to ask a question. And help me, because you know I'm here to learn.
Sure.
God said his name would be in Jerusalem. And they say that Moses, did everything at Mount Gerizim. If his name is in Jerusalem, but he did the miracles at the mountain, is there a difference between the two?
Well, it was not Moses, it was Joshua, because remember, Moses went off the mountain and gone. So Joshua comes in, and the covenant is reconfirmed on this side in Israel, because it's the place of entry. So I can't answer that question exactly for you, because you're asking me to make a value judgment. Were they right or were they wrong is what they want. It sounds like you want me to answer. I think it's more complicated than that. How about I present some evidence and some ideas and some facts, and we can sort this out. But is it even important for us to figure out who's right and who's wrong? Because we actually have a lot of information and texts and stories that tell us what happened throughout history of Israel. And throughout history of Israel, there have always been people who said, we're not going to go along with this. We're against this. We're going to make a stand and do something else. And, that's what it is. So I can't give you a value judgment right now. I don't think it's way too premature. But I want us to get more into history and information and data. And then we'll probably figure this out ourselves.
Okay.
Yes.
So you'll forgive me if I'm jumping ahead. You can stop me.
It's okay.
If I am. But there's an important verse in let me put my reading glasses on. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. And I think one of the perspectives we've lost in history, because we've lost the law, essentially the law of primogeniture. So the inheritance goes to the firstborn. And, that's very significant in biblical history, Jacob and Esau. You just see this. And with Joseph, you have Ephraim and Manasseh. Everything was subverted by the crossing of the hands, right?
Right.
Well, we know who was the firstborn of the tribes. It wasn't Judah, it wasn't Ephraim, it was Reuben. So what does 1 Chronicles say? It says, now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was indeed the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph,
Right.
the sons of Israel, the northern tribes. So that the genealogy, so think Joseph, think Ephraim, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. Yet, Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's. The sons of, so somehow it seems that the birthright is still Joseph's, yet Judah is placed as the ruler.
Yeah.
So I almost see it like from a professional standpoint, like the corporate world, where you hire people, like you're sort of interviewing, right? So God sees outside of time. He saw that Judah was going to be. He saw that the house of David was going to be his choice. He saw the Messiah, where, of course. But in space and time, it had to play out. There was an auditing process. And so, boom, 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 boom.
That's good. That's good. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, we got to get into Kings and Chronicles and things like that, books that people rarely study these things in, because I think this is where the history is. This is, if you want to know anything about the tribes and sons of Israel and their history, that's really where it is. That's the reason why those books actually exist and why they're named the way they are. But we can learn a lot about Samaritans by understanding their history, even from those books. Like, these are the origins. So I want to share a couple of facts with you about Samaritans. I don't know how much you know, so I'm just going to give you a random important things to know about Samaritans. So both ancient Samaritans and Judeans believed themselves to be the people of Israel, descendants of patriarch Jacob. There's no denying that the original Samaritans knew that they were descendants of Jacob. Okay? Genetically, that's who they were. And so did Judeans. Both viewed the Torah of Moses as their main holy text and worshiped God of Israel exclusively. They didn't believe in other gods. They didn't have any other deities. They didn't have any other religions that they embraced. They actually had the same religion of Moses, the same core text, the books of Moses is what they looked at. And so that's why there was so much overlap in their faith in antiquity. That's why I said Samaritans and Judeans were more alike than different. Because guess what? Who else in the world did that? Nobody. All the other nations did whatever they thought was right and worshipped many gods and goddesses, but not Samaritans, not them.
I'm confused. I apologize if you've already talked about this and I missed it, but somewhere, I don't know if it was Ezra or whatever, it says the Samaritans are resettled people.
Yes.
So they weren't Jewish.
We'll get into that. I'm talking about ancient Samaritans. We haven't gotten into.
Really ancient.
We're talking about pre that time. We're talking about the separation of the kingdoms, the northern kingdom, southern kingdom, early history. We haven't gone to Babylon yet, but obviously the history of that region. All right,
So when you're saying Samaritans are you more saying Israel?
Yeah. So let me put it this way. You missed that part because you were actually out of the room when we came in. So we talked about, that's okay, don't worry about it. I'll repeat it because it's worth repeating. Americans are Americans. I can start putting pictures of people on the screen that look very different colors, different shapes, different religious beliefs. They're all Americans. We call them all Americans, right? So this is how it is with Samaritans. There are different kinds of Samaritans out there. We want to group them all into one little clique and just say, this is who they are. But they're not unified. So I will show you that there are actually different varieties of Samaritans. In fact, I think I can even show that to you in the Brit Chadashah, for that matter. But I do think that there is a clue to these kinds of things. And we need to understand. And so the scriptures you're bringing out, as far as Ezra and Nehemiah, the time of return, absolutely relevant. We'll get into that when we get into the origins of the people, how they came to be, how they got their names, why they're called what they're called, why aren't they just called Israelites, why are they called Samaritans, basically, and things like that. So we'll get into that. So stick a pin in this, let's hold it. Let me get through a couple of random facts, and we'll come back to that. We'll circle around. I promise I will answer your question in great detail. So the Torah of Moses united them. They were descendants from the same person. Essentially, both Samaritans and Judeans spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, Judeo-Greek, and they were roughly equal in population in the first century. What is different today from antiquity is that Samaritans were numerically just as many as Judeans back then. And that today they're like nobody. We never hear about them. But why? Because there's only about 1,000 of them left in the world. That's it. But they were in millions and millions back then, just like Jews were in millions and millions. It's just their population has dwindled down to just a handful of people today. And so, yeah, they're not loud, they're not noisy, because they're very, very small people. But back in those days, they actually spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, Judeo-Greek. They were multilingual people, just like every other Jew who lived in that area, by the way. If you didn't realize this, that's what they did. So they spoke multiple languages always. So since ancient times, both Judeans and Samaritans were led by priests and believed that one day Redeemer of Israel would come to lead them further. So they were led by priests, and they knew that somebody was coming. Somebody special was coming. That was true of Judeans, that was true of Samaritans. I don't know exactly what their sources always were, but they seem to have believed that. Both had temple-centered worship in the first century, and they complemented their temple-centered worship with synagogues. Did you know the Samaritans had synagogues? They did. Some of very beautiful mosaics today in Israel Museum are from Samaritan synagogues. They also had synagogue worships, and they still have synagogue worship, even though they still, well, their temple is destroyed, essentially, but they still do that. Both groups viewed each other with hostility, as heretics, as imposters, who did not teach God's truth correctly. So they were mutually exclusive. They were alienating each other mutually. Both groups said, nah, you guys are not it. We are it. You are not. And in that, they could not agree. So you could see where the conflict came to be, but it wasn't always so clear-cut. And as I said, there's more than one kind of Samaritan, so please be aware of that. We'll get to that. I want to illustrate to you something on the story of the Good Samaritan. I know it's a familiar story, a famous one, and even people who never read the Bible know the story of the Good Samaritan, right? I believe it to be true. The people who read the Bible think they know it. However much of what they think they know and understand about the story does not really come from the story itself, but it comes from the commentary they heard. I believe that. Why? Because I hear people tell me everything they know from that story, and I say, really? That really happened? You know. And so here's a couple of things. Do you know that the story is not its own unit, but an answer to a very specific question? The story that Yeshua tells is not the story. The story is an answer. So do you know the question, by the way? Because if you know the story, but you don't know the question that was asked, how in the world would you even understand it? Because you got the answer. So do you realize that the Good Samaritan was never called good in the story? Not even once. How about that? We call him the Good Samaritan, but he was never called good. Not even once. So why in the world do we call him good? As I said, tradition. Tradition. So here's the beginning. I got to rewind it. This is me rewinding it all the way. Luke chapter 10. It says, and a lawyer, so a man studied in the law, studying the Torah, stood up and put him to the test. So this is a man who studied law is talking to Yeshua, saying, Teacher, Rabbi, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? So that's question number one. So the question that Yeshua gets asked, how do I enter into God's domain? How do I inherit eternal life? He's going to give him an answer. He said to him, what is written in the Torah? How does it read to you? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind and your neighbor as yourself. So you go. We know this, okay? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Number one, right? Ve'achavta Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nefshecha b'chol me'adecha. And it also says, Ve'achavta l'riacha kamocha. You should love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, this is the whole Torah, right? Yeshua taught these very kinds of things in other places. So, and he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. So this is a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable because it says, how do you inherit eternal life? The answer is, follow Torah, love God, love your neighbor, and you will live. Now, people want to make it a lot more complicated than that. But I'll let the gospel speak for what it is. But wishing to justify himself, so apparently that wasn't enough, he said this to Jesus. And who is my neighbor? So I am all down for loving my neighbor. But who is my neighbor? Who qualifies? Who disqualifies? So you understand, it's a technical question. He's a guy who studies Torah, so he needs to know, how do I define these things? And then Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among the robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place, saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him when he saw him. He felt compassion. And he came to him and bandaged him up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Let's keep reading. And on the next day he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you." Which of these, this is now Yeshua saying, after telling the story, which of these do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, and this is the person who studies the Torah, okay, the scholar right there, the one who showed mercy, the one who showed helios towards him. Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." So he answered, "Who is my neighbor?" by telling a story, which is what a rabbi would do. This is a very rabbi-like thing to do. Oh, you wanted an answer, so let me tell you a story so that you can have my answer, but it's going to be built into the story. It's going to be in there, and you're going to have to do a little bit of work to extract it. So he says, "So what do you think? Who is the real neighbor here?" And he tells them, of course, it's the one who was showed mercy. The fact that he's Samaritan doesn't really matter. That's really not the point of the story. People try to make it all about ethnic or racial or religious differences and say it's all about Samaritan. Well, it's actually not. It's the person who showed mercy. He acted kindly towards him. And he says, go and do the same. Be that kind of a person. Be like the merciful Samaritan. See, I'm going to call him the merciful Samaritan now, because that's about the only adjective that you're going to see in all these verses describing him. So I did this on purpose, and I say it like this. There's a lot of questions in this story, because the story is just a story. Was the man on the other side of the road a Jew? That's the question. We don't know, actually. The story doesn't tell us. We have no idea if he was a Jew or Gentile. He was going between Jerusalem and Jericho. He could have been another Samaritan for that matter. We don't know. What was this Samaritan doing on the same road? We also don't know. We actually have no clue. Was the man left on the side of the road asking for help? Was he like laying out there moaning and groaning and crying and complaining and asking to be helped? "Help, please, someone." Did he even show any signs of life? Or was he completely passed out, bleeding on the side of the road, and you have no idea whether he's dead or alive? You just see a body laying on the side of the road, left for dead. We actually don't know. We are told he's being left half dead, but we don't know what was happening with that person. So we're not even given enough details to make a determination whether the person acted right or wrong, whether the priest did right or wrong, or Levi did right or wrong. And so we just kind of like left with these. We're supposed to figure this out, but we're not given enough information. Yes, Drake.
You know, I think this is interesting because the way a lot of these stories are structured is if you look at them carefully, people tend to draw their own conclusions about them beyond what they actually say. So like in John 8, when the woman is about to be stoned, it's like, it doesn't actually say that whether or not she,
Or she's guilty or not.
yeah, it doesn't. And people just assume that she was, or, they'll try to extrapolate, but it never actually says.
We extrapolate. And this is what I say, the commentary that we actually have about the stories is what determines of how we read the story, believe it or not. Somebody at some point gave you a commentary that filled in the gaps and answered all these questions. And whatever those commentaries are, be they true or not, we actually don't know, because the story doesn't actually tell us if we look at it critically. So how did the priest and Levite and the Samaritan react towards the man on the side of the road? Well, they reacted very differently, and I think that's the point of the story. It's not even who was going down the road. Of course, the priest and Levite, that's important, and Samaritan. So priest and Levite is somebody of a very high standing, and Samaritan is supposedly someone of very low standing. Is it really an ethnic thing? Is it a racial thing? Is it a religious thing? So by calling the Samaritan good, the other characters in the story are defined as bad. And I hope you understand what I call the sleight of hand. Because if I'm going to characterize Samaritan as good, then I'm going to automatically paint the other ones as bad. But were they bad? They just saw a dead body on the side of the road and they passed. I want you to think a little bit about a life of a priest or a life of a Levite, I want you to think a little bit about what is going through their mind. And that's because you and I are not faced with a situation like this in everyday life. We do not even think along these lines, but these people who traveled on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, people were attacked by the robbers all the time. This was a dangerous place. What's important right here in this passage is this concept, okay? Splanchonon, or rachamim in Hebrew, is the concept of compassion, empathy, mercy, or pity. This is what the person who stopped felt. This is what he was moved by. He was moved by this compassion, this mercy. There's another important word that comes up later in this same passage. This is as Yeshua is teaching. He talks about mercy, or what we can translate as favor, or love, or faithfulness, or loyalty, or goodness, or grace. And the word is helios, or the word is chesed in Hebrew. So that's a very common word. But again, there's not one way to translate it. There's not really one side of this word that encapsulates all of these things. So the word is multifaceted. So he showed him rachamim. He showed them mercy, or he showed him chesed. He showed them kindness, love, grace. That's how the Samaritan essentially acted towards that person on the side of the road.
If we read it that way, then it's kind of like the story of the wicked judge. The wicked judge, he deviates from his normal wickedness to do a good thing.
Yeah.
And so that could actually be the tinge of that story. He's not necessarily a good character so much as he did an exceptional thing once.
Again, we characterize people by calling them good. It's not even in the text. I mean, he's a person who showed mercy, and we assume he's a decent person because he actually gave money to the innkeeper, and he did an honorable thing. He clearly was kind and honorable person in that moment. We actually don't know anything about him besides that. But in that moment, he was definitely right. And what he did is he acted the kind of way that God would want us to act. We should remember the whole point of the story is for Yeshua to answer one simple question. Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That's what he's getting to. And he's going to ask a question, which one of these do you think is being the kind of a neighbor that he should be?
Well, in parents, if you're a parent in this room, you do this all the time with your kids, right? You say, if you want this thing, and the kid says, child says back, well, my friends are doing this. So if your friends are going to go jump off a cliff, would you follow them too? It's an illustration. It's a theoretical.
Right.
And so whether this actually happened or not, we don't know.
Actually, yeah. It probably didn't happen. It's a story that Yeshua tells. And it's an amusing story. It's an interesting story. It's an insightful story. It's a teaching. It's for us to walk away with a lesson from that story. That's really what it's about. But there's more in the story. And I really want you to see there's a depth to this. In Jewish culture, to be unburied was perceived as a curse. So here's this guy laying on the side of the road. Unburied body. An abandoned corpse, essentially. So Elijah, by the way, he prophesied that Jezebel would not have a burial. That was her punishment. That was for her wickedness. One thing was not going to happen to her. She wasn't going to have a tomb. And if you know the story, she fell off a tower, got eaten by dogs, and her bones were digested, and boom, no tomb, no burial for Jezebel. So, pretty gruesome way to go, right? But that's what she gets. So, Tobit, the story of Tobit is a good one. He secretly buried the bodies of other Jews whom the king slaughtered in Babylon. If you read the book of Tobit, I know it's not in the canonical Bible, but it's there, and it's a 2nd century BCE Jewish writing. This man was righteous because he actually secretly found bodies of dead Jews and buried them. Why? Because he was an honorable man who wanted to do them kindness. He wanted to show them chesed. Unclaimed bodies. Here's a passage in the Mishnah, in the tractate Nazir. A lot of people do not know about this passage, but this is a very important one. It says, a high priest and Nazir. Nazir is a Nazirite. Person who took a Nazirite vow. May not become impure for their relatives. Torah prohibits in Leviticus. It says the priest is not allowed to defile himself and make himself impure for the relative. Not allowed to do that. But he may for an abandoned body. Why? Because mercy needs to be shown. Because mercy actually trumps these kinds of things. And what I want you to realize is a lot of times people read the Talmud, people read the Mishnah and say, oh, it's just a legal book, it's full of these callous rules. I want you to realize that the ethic in the Mishnah is just as much as beautiful as you would read it on the pages of Brit Hadashah or coming from the mouth of Yeshua. It's full of mercy and kindness. This is in the Mishnah, and the sage just says, not allowed, the priest is not allowed to mourn his own relatives. But if they come across an abandoned dead body, they should defile themselves, and they should do that, because that person's dignity needs to be protected, and he probably deserves a burial, and there's nobody else to do it, so you know what, the priest gets to do it.
I mean, in Devarim it says that like if you find a body in the wilderness and there's no ascribed murderer, then what you break the neck of a calf over, and you do it for spiritual, and so.
Yeah. So there's a lot of piety is what I'm trying to say about not abandoning a body of another individual laying on the side of the road. But I want you to realize is that the priests and Levites have a very interesting concern, and that is becoming defiled because they're traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho, and what they're going to do is very, very important.
I was just going to say that there's a bigger overlying law of this situation in the dead body, and that is defiling the land. If we fail to show mercy for the dead body, we defile the land, which is even a greater.
Yes.
It is something that continues to grow.
That's why the priest was allowed to defile his body in order to do what? To do righteousness, so the very land of Israel is not defiled. That's more important. Show chesed, mercy. So. I know our time is pressing up, so I'm going to wrap it up really quickly, but I want to show you something. The story is not so simple. There's actually a lot of depth. The fact that these characters are in the story are who they are is not coincidental. So you actually don't know what's going on there as far as the priests and Levite, what is happening with them, what considerations they're making. So in Yeshua's day, burying the dead body that no one else could care for was seen as a selfless act of kindness and mercy. But there's no such commandment in the Torah. Do you know that? Not exactly. And the Sadducean priests had absolutely no compelling reasons to bother with the corpse. Because Sadducees believed in the Torah. They didn't really care about the prophets very much. It's not that they were wrong or anything like that, but they said the Torah said everything important that needs to be said. And the prophets are basically just repeating or commenting or calling us to obey. And that's kind of an issue. So a Sadducean priest would have a very different view of that. They would actually not embrace the tradition. The tradition I'm talking about, that's described in the book of Nazir right there, the tradition that I am describing to you, that Tobit followed, for example, the Sadduceic priests will probably not follow. And this is how studying Sadducees actually helps you. We did this in the way in the back, and I explained to you how their theology was formed. And now it plays in. If you can understand that this priest is probably a Sadducee, of course he passed on the other side of the road, because he actually doesn't believe that there's such a moral obligation to bury an unclaimed body, because that's not a part of his tradition, because he is by the book guy, and it's not in the book. So this tradition which Yeshua embraced, he did embrace this tradition. In his teaching is the idea of helios, mercy, compassion, loving kindness, chesed, towards other people. It transcends all other commandments. How many times did Yeshua said that mercy transcends all commandments? And treating an outsider in this way is even more commendable, which is that whole idea of him being really the neighbor. That's the answer to the question that he's giving is really about the neighbor. So what should I do to inherit eternal life? And who is my neighbor? Those are the questions that were asked. Remember Luke 10? And then he answers them. So the Torah scholar answered by quoting Deuteronomy 6:5, love your neighbor, Leviticus 19:18, treat others, treat your neighbors yourself, but there's more in Leviticus is what I want you to realize. And Leviticus 19, after those verses, says, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you. So, look, it says, Ezrach michem, let's see, ger hagar. So the ger who lives with you, literally, the one who resides with you, will be as an Ezrach. It will be like a native born. And you shall love him as yourself. Lo kamucha. Look at that. So what is he being told right there in Leviticus 19, besides loving your neighbor? Loving an outsider, loving a stranger, even a foreigner. Because that's what the word ger really means. I know in the modern Judaism, the word ger means a convert, but in ancient Torah passages, the word ger just means an outsider, a person who settled among you, a sojourner. And that's really what it is. So That's what lies behind this idea. There's a lot of related words that you could study in Leviticus 18. I'm just going to skip that right there. To my main point, Yeshua alluded to the context of the Torah passage that the man quoted to him and pointed out that even strangers, even outsiders, are to be treated as neighbors. That's really what his teaching was. And thus he answered the question, who is my neighbor? So is this passage really about Samaritans? Is this passage really about ethnic lines? Is this passage about religious lines? No, this passage is about being a decent human being, a mensch, a person who shows kindness, mercy, and love to other people because they deserve it. We make it to be about good Samaritan, and that means the other guys are, by definition, not good because they didn't stop, right? But that's really not the core of the teaching.
I can't help but think of so many places in the scriptures where mercy is shown and kindness is shown to be the important value. Just as if a husband says, "I love you, you're the most important one in my life," and brings chocolate and flowers, but dishonors his wife and beats her and runs around, that's not love. Love is what you do, and but for the right motivation. When Yeshua went to dinner at the Pharisees' home, and a woman came in and washed his feet, poured the perfume out, and she defiled her hair by, and this is what, and he said, "This is for my burial." Right.
That's mercy, that's kindness. So I think we get the gist of the lesson right there and the answer. And so the story of the Samaritan is really not about Samaritan. I mean, he's a character. He's definitely in there. But it really is not about him. Does it really tell us anything about Samaritans? Not so much. Although it does reveal to us some attitudes that ancient Judeans had about Samaritans and how people understood these things. And so we will continue thinking about that as we explore this topic of Samaritans. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry I had to kind of wrap it up because we're running late, but let's do Kiddush.